So today we're going to work with exercise 214. My brain is fried apparently this morning. And this is one of those exercises that's a little bit hard because you all have very different skills. Those of you that have been through 135 have spent a bunch of time in Photoshop, and I would love it if you thought enough about it to maybe make your own material entirely from scratch. Those of you that have never taken 135 or are not comfortable in Photoshop, I'm not expecting you to make something completely from scratch. But the purpose of today as a day in this class is to really learn how materials come together, what files constitute a good material, how do they apply, what settings can be adjusted to get a realistic looking material. And so I'm going to go through using some websites to get material files that are ready to go, and I'll talk through kind of how they are put together, what makes a good material file, and then we'll pause, and then I'll go into kind of how do you make something entirely from scratch in Photoshop, just so that you have the experience of seeing that come together. If it's too much to try to do one through Photoshop, it's not a Photoshop class. I'm not expecting you to, but at least I want you to be aware that that strategy exists. So some of you may have already done this. If you search for V-Ray materials out on the internet, the Flying Architecture site is great because it actually has V-Ray materials that are built for Rhino. But there's a lot of other sites that are out there that have V-Ray materials that are made for Maya or for 3D Studio Max or Cinema 4D, and those kinds of files. This V-Ray materials from the Renderer Box Studio, which is vraymaterials.co.uk, is a good example of these sites. There's a bunch of other ones. I'll show you some of them in just a second. At this particular site, if I go to V-Ray Materials, you can see that they have a bunch of free materials that I can download. And here's hammered gold, I don't know, light tinted glass, there's a cobblestone, there's a drain. I mean, there's a variety of them. Most of them say 3ds Max on them. Some of them say just V-Ray material. Some of them will say Maya on them. If they say 3ds Max, for example, it's a material that's built for 3D Studio Max. That's not going to work in Rhino, and so we need to adapt the file so that it will work in Rhino and V-Ray. And we're going to use some of those as examples today to learn how materials work and what files are associated with them. So I've downloaded a bunch of materials already. One of them I downloaded was this pavement drain because it should be a reasonably good one to look through, and a variety of other ones that I'll bring up such that we can play around with them a little bit. I downloaded them. They came in as zip files, so I copied them onto my flash drive and unzipped all of the files. And if we look at one, so let's do that pavement drain one, for example. If we look at it, there's a variety of files that come together that help make this. And so if we look here, this is the 3D Max material. It's a VR scene file. We've got an MB file, which is a Maya file. Neither of those are relevant to us. They, of course, contain settings that would be nice if we could use them, but we can't. But they also contain some basic image files. And so if I look here under diffuse, for example, of course it's going to open Photoshop, we can see, lo and behold, here is an image file that contains a bunch of the pavers and also this drain. Okay. Likewise, if I were to open this displacement, right, I'd end up with kind of a black and white image with some dark areas and some light areas. I tend to have a little bit of griping with the way that people make these, but we'll talk through that in a second. And that's another piece of this puzzle. So let's talk about what they actually do. Let me show you one more example here. A lot of times screens are really good at showing you. Okay, so we have a regular image file that is the screen, and then we have an opacity. Now, this is a good one, which is a black and white image. And it's going to tell me what's transparent and what's not transparent. So let's see how these come together in Rhino. And so I'm opening this file. There's a material test file with geometry that you can load up from the website. If you go to the Digital Tools site, and you go to today's exercise, it'll be listed right here, Materials Test 3DM. You can download that file and use that file so that you don't have to create any geometry to practice with. It looks virtually the same as this file here. Okay. So when I start talking about materials, I'm going to go ahead and open the V-Ray material editor, and instead of just loading materials like we've done before, let me get rid of some materials so it's not quite as confusing here. Previously we've gone to load material, and we've gone to our Q drive, we've gone into resources, V-Ray materials, and we've picked, I don't know, a basic concrete and loaded this file up. Okay, and it shows up here, and we see a nice little preview. Life's great. Okay, but what happens if we want to build our own material? And in this case, I'm going to build it from one of the sample files that I downloaded. Okay, so let's start with that wire screen example. I'm going to right-click on Scene Materials, and I'm going to say Create Material, and it's going to be a standard material. And then I'm going to rename this material, I don't know, Screen Brush Metal, whatever. And I'll say OK. Okay, so right now if I were to preview it, I get basically a gray blob because all I have is a diffuse color that's gray. And we've gone as far enough in the world of V-Ray such that you could change the color by clicking on the color button of the diffuse. Now, if I wanted to put an image on here instead, right, I can click on this little M next to where it says color. And this is going to be something that's thematically similar no matter where you are in V-Ray. There's usually a button that looks like this with a lowercase m if nothing's been applied. That m changes to an uppercase M if there has been a map applied. Okay? So in this instance, I'm going to click on this little M. And I have a variety of options that show up here. There's a drop-down list, and everything starts with text and then followed by a bunch of other things. Okay? And so some of these are designed for you to be able to build a material entirely within V-Ray. And sometimes it's useful to do that, usually in like a metal or something with a pretty consistent color. But a lot of times you're going to want to go from some kind of an image to start from. And that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to go to text bitmap, which basically means I want an image file to be applied. And so when I pick that, it jumps into this open up a bitmap image. And so let me go to my flash drive where I saved. Let's do the, I wonder if this is better. Yeah, this is good because it's got a bunch of different stuff. Okay, so I'm going to pick, usually it's called diffuse. It's usually the basic image file. I'll go ahead and say open, and if I click on preview, we can see that yes, there is a piece of a fence, right, that's kind of rusted, has a black background, and I can see the image itself. If I say OK, and then I preview my image, okay, I have kind of a screen, but it's got a solid black behind it. Okay, so let's say that this was done. I need to rename this because it should be rusted metal. Okay, so let's say I want to apply this to my objects, and I'll apply material to selection. There it is. And so we can see a preview of it right now because I have this showing in rendered mode. Oops, sorry. I have the showing in rendered mode, so we can kind of see a preview of what it looks like. It's obviously not transparent at all. Okay? If I were to go ahead and render it out, I should probably make this smaller. Hold on one second. It looks a lot like the preview I have in that it's a solid black object that has this image applied to it. Okay? I'd like to make that a little bit better. So let me go back to my V-Ray Materials editor. Okay? And next to where it says diffuse, see how that changed from a lowercase m to a capital M? That means there's been a map applied. I'm going to click on the M next to transparency. And I'm going to do the same thing. This time I'm going to pick, same thing of text bitmap, and I'm going to pick what they call, it's probably opacity is what they mean by transparency. And I'll go ahead and click open. And if I preview it, I should have a black and white image. Okay? Now, I can never remember which one is which on should it be black or should it be white in terms of what's transparent and what's not. It doesn't matter. I'll say OK. If it's backwards, there's a little checkbox for invert. And when I click invert and preview, it'll be the opposite. So makes life really easy. All I need is a black and white image. The idea here is that the things that are black or white will become transparent and the opposite will become opaque. So when I've gone ahead and I've said OK here, and if I go to preview, we'll find out really quickly if I did it correctly. So I did it incorrectly because all I have is the solid black left. So let me go back to, oh, come on, right, there we go. Let me go back to my map. Let me check the box for invert, and I'll say OK. And now I can click preview, and I should get just the metal. You see how that applies? Yeah, you can really see it now, right? Okay, so if I look at my live object here, we now have what looks like a mesh. Okay, it's transparent in between. The shadow is starting to become mesh-like. That's a good thing. So if I were to render this out, we went from having a solid object to now having one that has transparency to it. Okay? So it's looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this as we do this render, I hope. To one of these edges. And I'm going to go ahead and render it again. So we can kind of take a look at the edge. And you know what? It's gonna. We're gonna sacrifice a little bit of time right now, but I'm gonna make this a larger render. Because I want you to be able to see it in a little bit more detail. This is where once we do the networked render, this will go much, much faster. Okay, so if I look at this carefully, right, each one of these mesh pieces is just flat. You kind of see how that works? Okay. Now in reality, this mesh is going to have some geometry to it. And when we're making these kinds of surfaces, it's too much work to build every piece of the mesh in Rhino. So we'd like to just apply a material to it so that we don't have to worry about it. So let me go ahead and we'll minimize this for right now. And what I'm going to do is go back to my material editor, and I have two more options of things that I can apply. They're called bump and displacement, and they work slightly differently depending on what you're trying to build. Displacement takes a lot more horsepower from the computer. Bump is a little bit less demanding. Okay? Displacement works in whatever your default units are in Rhino. We're going to start with a displacement mask. I'm going to go ahead and check the box for displacement. I'm going to click on the M next to it, and I'm going to once again pick text bitmap, and there is displacement. Generally speaking, you want to think of displacement as large jumps in geometry. Bump is fine texture on the surface itself. Okay? So I'm going to pick displacement. I'll click open, and let's take a quick preview at what it looks like. Okay, it looks very similar to the black and white, but if we were looking at it a little bit closer, and let me go ahead and jump back here. Okay, see how it has slight shading on it? It goes from black to the edge is black, but it looks like it's almost curving. Okay, that's going to give us a profile in VRED. So what we're doing is what's black starts at layer 0. Right? So we'll say this is layer 0, this is black. Right? White is somewhere up here in space. This is white. And we'll call this layer 1. Okay? What this is doing is it's saying any value in this image that's black is going to stay right at layer 0. Okay? Any value that starts to turn gray is going to start to arc up to any value that's white, which will be up here. So we'll end up with a shape that looks something like this. right? Where this region is dark gray, right? This is medium gray, and this is white. Does that kind of make sense for how it's translating? Okay. So if we apply this back here, right, there it is. We'll go ahead and say OK. Now this value under displacement is in whatever your units are. So in my case, my units are in inches. If I type 1.0 here, the amount it's going to stick up is 1 inch. Okay, which is probably too much for the scale of this mesh. So I'm going to want it to be much less if V-Ray ever comes back to me here. I'm going to want this more to be maybe 1/8 of an inch. Okay, so I'll type in 0.125. And if I click preview, we may see a little bit of a change in the preview, but it's hard because it's at a small scale. Okay? However, if we go to render, we have to be patient for a second, we should see the change happen. Now notice this rendering is taking significantly more time than the previous render when this bump didn't exist, or this displacement didn't exist. So this is one of the hard things about adding displacement, is it really increases the complexity of what it is we're trying to render. So I know this takes time, but in the interest of trying to show you what this actually does, I want to let it run its course.
When will the network rendering be ready?
As soon as the computers are imaged, which I've been told is supposed to be in the next couple of weeks. And in 2 more classes, so a week from today or a week from Wednesday, so next week sometime is when we're really going to start needing the network rendering, and so I'm going to keep prodding people to try to get that accomplished. Okay, so we're starting to get the rendering out here, and you can see where each of these was previously flat, right? It now has that arc that I was talking about on each of these. So it adds a significant amount of realism to whatever the texture is you're trying to create. Okay, so I'm not going to let it finish, but you all see what's happening there. Okay? Let me go ahead and close this. Okay? And I'll go back to my materials. Now, I'm going to turn off displacement because we don't need displacement to render for this. And I'm going to turn on bump. Okay? And so bump is a lot like displacement. Right? This was displacement. Right? Bump is not doing large-scale moves like this. It's doing small-scale stuff. So if I had the surface here that was prior to having a bump applied, right? Most surfaces have a little bit of roughness to them, right? So the bump's designed to say that was the surface, and the surface actually looks a little bit more like this. So take what was flat and give a little bit of surface texture to it. Okay? It doesn't work in the same units, like where the last one, displacement, we said, oh, I want it to be 1/8 of an inch, therefore it's 0.125. Bump works more as like a percentage, right? Kind of a guess is the best way to put it. So I'm going to go ahead and pick bump. It's a text bitmap. I'll pick the bump setting, and I'll go ahead and say OK. And I'll say OK. And here, the default value is 1. If you really want to see it, you can jump up to 100. It gives you a little bit more. I'm going to do something about 10, and we'll see what happens. Okay? It's not as computer intensive as a displacement map, so it's going to go a little bit faster. And when this is done, we should see a little bit of texture. While we're waiting for that, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the bump image. A lot of times people use the same image for displacement and for bump. In this case, it's a different image. and you can see that there's a little bit of black and white flecking on these cross pieces, which, when we go to render, is going to give just a little bit of undulation on the rusted metal surface. And so you might be able to see it here a little bit better. Right? Do you guys see that a little bit? It's harder to perceive because it's just a little bit on the surface. But it adds a huge amount of realism during your renderings to have just a little bit of pitting on a surface and a little bit of shadowing. Okay? So what we've done is we've gone through bump maps and displacement maps. So in an ideal sense, this particular material would have a displacement map, it would have a bump map, and it would have, right, a transparency map to mark what's transparent, and it would have a diffuse map that gives us the basic color. So it has those four pieces together that give us a really good looking material. Does that make sense? Okay? Now, this, because it's a nice rusted metal, doesn't have a lot of shine to it. Okay? But sometimes there is material that does have shine to it, and we need to kind of solve that as an entity by itself as well. So I'm going to go ahead and move on from this rusted metal, and we'll load in a different material. Okay? Or excuse me, we'll create a different material. So I'm going to go to Create Material Standard, and in this case, we are going to go through the kind of the same steps. I'm going to start with a diffuse map, and so I will come down here and go to Text Bitmap, and I'm going to pick the asphalt. Okay? And it's going to give us the asphalt, I believe. Let me look at the files themselves. Part of this is because I didn't create the file. I have to kind of look at what they're going to give us. Right? So let's see here. There's the asphalt. Okay, looks like asphalt. They're going to apply this as a dirt map over the top. We're not going to do dirt maps today. So I'm just going to do the asphalt, and that's fine. I'll pick asphalt, and I can preview it. There it is. I'll go ahead and say OK. And let me rename this as to I try to be specific when I create names because of how many materials are out there. And so when I go back through and I look through my material archive or the material archive here at DVC, I want to be as specific as possible when I'm looking through kind of what describes it. So anyway, let's say it's this. If I go to preview, there it is. Okay, let me go ahead and apply this to my shapes. All right, and let me go back to here, and we'll go ahead and render it. Okay, so I have the asphalt applied. In this instance, it doesn't have a displacement map and it doesn't have a bump map, so it's just a flat image. It looks like it has some texture because the image looks like it has some texture, but it's not actually there. If I were to zoom in, we wouldn't see any of the texture. Okay, but that's not what I'm worried about in this particular example. I'll go back and add a displacement map in a second. But what I want to do is I want to change this from being a very matte material, right, no reflections, to being something where it looks like it's kind of wet, right, to where I could do a wet road instead of a dry road. So I'm going to come back to my material editor, and this time I'm going to right click and I'm going to say Create Layer Reflection. Okay? And when I create that reflection, notice up here I already have a capital M. Okay, that means because the reflection's already been applied. If I go in here and I go to Text Fresnel is the type of reflection that it is, and I can change this value for index of refraction. 1.55 is kind of a generic reflective value. If you're trying to create a material specific, like let's say you're trying to do a diamond, or you're trying to do something that has a very specific reflective value, if you Google IOR of diamond, IOR of whatever, jello, I don't know, whatever you're trying to make, right? Chances are there's a value there that's associated with it. For most common things, I have values that are listed in the book, but if you do a Google search, you'll be able to find whatever the value is. I'm going to leave it at 1.55 for now, and I'll go ahead and say OK. And I'll go ahead and click Preview. Okay, and when I preview that, it went from being dull and matte to having a little bit of shine on it. Okay, this may or may not be the right amount of shine, and this is where it takes a little bit of subjectivity to kind of look at this. So let me go ahead and render it. And so we can see right in here that it has an awful lot of reflection, right? Almost as if I polished this to like a more mirrored surface, right, of asphalt. It's probably too much. Maybe like a countertop or something, you know, too much. So let me go back and adjust that value, and I'm going to go right here into the glossiness, the highlight and the reflect values, and I'm going to dump those down. So we'll say it maybe point, if V-Ray doesn't crash on me in the middle of this. Put these at maybe 0.5 and 0.5. And if we go to preview, we'll see that it's a little, well, maybe not, maybe a little more, 0.7. We get a little bit of shine, but not too much shine. So if I were to render it, right, you have to kind of remember what this looked like. Okay, so if we look in here, we're getting a little bit of reflection, but not as shiny as it was, right? And this may or may not be the right value. My point being that you have to play with the values and keep doing test renders until you kind of dial in, this looks right. And a lot of rendering is what looks right. And trust your eyes in terms of seeing that piece of information. So, you know, as I'm looking at this, maybe I want it to be a little bit shinier than that, so I might come back here and up that value to maybe 0.85. Something like that. Right? Now I also said I'd come back and revisit the mapping. And so in this case, hold on a second. Thought I had it open, didn't I? Maybe I was working with the dirty asphalt. And so if let's see, all I had was asphalt by itself. All I had was this. I'd like to create a little bit of texture map from this. I could use this file by itself to add a little bit of bumpiness to this particular surface, but it's mostly gray. It doesn't have a good amount of black and white. So the right strategy would be to open that file in Photoshop. So this is going in the direction of those of you that have some Photoshop experience, right? This is how you can make these transitions. Let me go to all programs. Let me go to Photoshop. It's under Adobe Design Standard CS6. Go ahead and open Photoshop here. And let me go ahead and open that file from my flash drive. Oops. You can see I have a folder called V-Ray Materials Manufacturer because I make materials when I can't find what I'm looking for. So these are all ones that are in process. Anyway, let me get into my asphalt. Okay, so here it is, right? I want this to be black and white in kind of a high contrast to give it that that pixelization. So first thing I'll do is convert it to black and white. If you have the book, by the way, this is in Photoshop 1.1. We'll convert it to black and white. So I'm going to go to a layer, new adjustment layer, and I'm going to go to color channel mixer. I'll say OK. And I'll check the box for monochrome, which converts it into black and white. You can't really see the difference because this was pretty much gray already, but I want to make sure I do that. Right? There are sometimes presets here that will help in the overall look of the image. Nothing's really going to change because this is virtually black and white to begin with. So I'll leave it like that. Now the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to turn on Levels. Right here. Okay? And I end up with a reasonable, those of you that have thought about Photoshop before or have worked in Digital Tools 1, you've seen something like this before. The histogram actually looks pretty good, but I need to exaggerate it. So I need much more white in my image. So let's pull that white value back. And let me pull back the black value. And I end up with an image that has some nice bright white highlights and some nice dark pieces to it. And so if we look at this, that was my original image. There's my black and white that I'm going to use as my bump map for this particular piece. So I'll go ahead and go to File, Save for Web. It's not that challenging if I'm working from one of these pre-dones. I'll click Save. We'll call this Asphalt. I'm going to call it a bump because I think I want to apply it as a bump, but we'll see. Notice that a lot of these have similar conventions to naming. You have the name of the material followed by bump if it's a bump map, displacement if it's a displacement map, transparency if it's a transparency map, or diffuse if it's just the color. So I'll go ahead and say Save. Perfect. And let me go back into Rhino, and I'm going to come down here, turn on bump map, click on my little lowercase m, click on text bitmap, and I'll pick my bump. Say OK. OK. And my value, I'm going to increase it a little bit. We'll go to 10. And if I go to preview, we should see a little bit more texture to it. And so in order to see it, let's zoom in on my objects a little bit. And like that. And we'll go ahead and do a render. And see how it looks. And so sometimes when you're doing renderings, you can get away with stuff if things are further away from you, right? The closer they are to you, the more detailed the material has to be. So that's why I'm zooming in to see this as I'm rendering it. Let's see how it's turning out. Okay, so it's not too bad. It's giving me a little bit of a bump on the surface. Okay. The alternative to this, just so that we can see it as an example, is to, instead of applying it as a bump, apply it as a displacement map. Right. So I'm going to turn off bump for a second, turn on displacement, and I'm going to load that same. The bump and the displacement are virtually the same thing. One just has a higher value than the other. Okay. So let's say that this is 0.25. That might be too much.
It's like a 1/4 inch.
Yeah. It's too much for a road. I'm trying
Not
to.
much.
I'm trying. Yeah. It depends what road and where. I'm trying to make it so that you can actually see this happening. Right. So let me go ahead and render, and let's see if we can get a little bit better detail. Remember, this is going to slow way down when you add the displacements. Okay, so we can already see, just as it's starting, even though it's pixelated, you can see that the old line was sharp here, the new line's sticking up a lot more, so we're going to have a lot of that displacement happening. So I'm going to go ahead and let this run a little bit because it's going to take a while to finish. And what I want to do is I want to show you, for those of you who've taken 135, I want to show you kind of the process in Photoshop, what you would go through to make this. For those of you that haven't taken 135 but feel comfortable in Photoshop, you could try it too if you want. If you haven't taken 135, maybe this will be a way of trying to convince you to take 135. But the truth is, with any of these software programs, the more global knowledge you have. If you know Photoshop, then it can play into these Rhino materials. If you know Rhino, you might want to know Photoshop for some post-processing. They all work together to some extent. So let's say that I wanted to create a material from scratch. If I want to create a material, one, I have to have an idea of what the material would be. And so a lot of times I look for a basic image to work with. So let's do a search.creativecommons.org, and I want corrugated metal. I'm just making stuff up. I know I don't have corrugated metal, so if I'm going to do a material, I might as well. So I'm probably never going to spell corrugated correctly. Maybe? I don't know, I can't spell. So, okay, so let's look at a variety of examples here. I have a terrible selection. That's awful. Let's do a Google image search instead. Corrugated metal. There. Maybe I spelled it wrong. There we go. So we've got some examples here. Okay, let's take a look at this one. Let's view the image. Alright, something like this. This is not bad, though it's going to repeat. Those scratches are going to be a little bit challenging. Let's see if we can find that one. Alright, this one's not bad. And I'm going to save the image once I find it. And we'll save it. I have metal here somewhere. There we go. And I'll click save. Still going. Things take time. Right? I saved it as a JPEG. Now I'm going to go ahead and open that in Photoshop. If I can find it. Open. Okay, and so I'll bring this particular piece in, and I don't know for sure yet whether this is a tiling texture or not, whether somebody already did this work for me. So one of the things that I have to do is I have to check if it tiles. And if it doesn't tile, then I have a little bit more work to do. The idea behind tiling is that if I had a larger area here, hold on a second, I'll show you this. If I had an image, it helps if I unlock the background. If I had an image like this, and I were to copy and paste it together, would they come together and seam like that, okay, without there being a really noticeable seam between them? And so the truth is, in this context, it's pretty good seaming this direction. It's not so good seaming this direction, okay, because I can see that seam. And if you imagine using these pieces over and over again on a big, large surface, if the seams aren't accurate, it's not going to look very good in Rhino. So we have to fix that problem. So let me jump backwards here to where I have just my image, okay. And I need to work with a few things before I solve this completely. So the first thing that we noticed was that this bottom didn't line up with the top. Chances are, because these are straight segments, it's because the picture is slightly skewed, so we need to correct for that. And so a lot of times if I drag a little bit of a guide over, we can see what happens with it. So there's my guide. It's right at the edge. Here, if we go down to the bottom, my shadow gets off slightly. There it is. It should be right over here. It's off slightly. So let's try to fix that first. And I'll do that using the transform and then skew. And remember, this is optional. If you've never done Photoshop before, I'm not going to ask you to work through it. But I can skew the image over such that it lines up, hopefully, all the way along there. Okay. It doesn't hurt to do a couple spots. So let me come back to this edge. And I'm going to come down here. Oh yeah, it's way off. Right? So we'll take this and we'll skew this back over to there. I'll come back to my first one, which is over here, because that last skew probably made this one slightly off. So let me adjust that one a little bit as well. We'll come back up to the top and make sure that the top still looks pretty good. Okay, so it looks pretty good. If I press Control-0, I can see the whole screen. You can see that I clipped off, or I skewed off a bunch of this. Yeah, go ahead and apply. This side, we can see that it's transparent there. So I'm going to have to do a crop next. so that I get rid of the part that I don't have. So I'll use the crop tool here, and we'll crop off part of this. Now, when I do the cropping, it wouldn't hurt me to be kind of intelligent about where I cut. Okay, so I'm going to try to pick the kind of the center of one of those troughs of the corrugations. So we'll say something like that, and I'm going to make this side about the opposite of that trough. Okay, something like that. The top and the bottom I'm not overly worried about because there's not a big strong seam that's going to be there. So I'll go ahead and say OK at this point. And I now have an image that looks okay. If I were to tile this right now, it still wouldn't tile perfectly. It'd be pretty close. But in order for it to tile perfectly, I'm going to use a special filter that's in Photoshop called Offset. And it's under Filter, Other, and then Offset. By the way, this is all written out. It's, do you have your book? Can I borrow it for a second? It is under Photoshop 1.22 is creating the tiling texture, and then we go backwards to 1.19, 1.20, and 1.21 to create each of the different types of maps. So it is all in the book if you want to go back and review any of those steps. So I'm going to use the offset command, and I'm going to pick half my value. I knew that when I downloaded this it was about 1,000 by 1,000, so we'll do about 500 by about 500. And what this does is it takes the image there's my image. It says cut it here and cut it here. And if I had 1, 2, 3, 4, it says, okay, that's fine. Take 4 and reassemble it so that 4 is now here, right? 1 is now here, 2 is now here, and 3 is now here. Okay? And what this does is it ensures that 4 and 3, right, where it was cut, has a perfect seam. That is right here and here. And those will line up when I continue on with my next piece. So if this goes like this would be 4, and this would be 3. So see how 3 and 4, that seam corresponds to this seam? Does that make sense? Right? And so it works in both directions. So I need to do a little bit more post-processing on this just to make it perfectly seamless. So I'll go ahead and say OK. If I were to zoom in, we can see a faint little line showing up right there. I'm going to make that go away using the clone stamp tool. And we'll do a nice soft brush. Good. And make the brush a little bit bigger. I'm going to hold down Alt as my sample area, and we're just going to fuzz those just a little bit. So this is probably not the most dramatic piece to have picked to show you the change. But it will work. Oops. Alright, let me press Control-0 so I can zoom out a little bit. And so now this appears to be fairly seamless, right? There's a little bit of a color difference between this side and that side, but we're going to go with it for right now. So when this is done, I'm going to go ahead and click File, Save for Web. And I'll click Save. And we need our own folder for it. This is diffuse, so I add underscore diffuse to it. Okay, so now I need to think carefully about what's happening on this particular piece of steel. And so I have some places that are basically sticking out, and I have some places that would be flat, and I need to make sure that those places correspond correctly to my color. So what I'll do is I'll use my selection tool, and I'm going to select each of these flat pieces to start. Something like this, and I'll hold down Shift and continue to select each of those flat pieces. Now, if I were doing this not in front of you, not live, I would probably spend a little bit more time and be a little bit more accurate with how I did this, but we'll still get to the end result. I just don't want you to have to sit and watch me do this for too long. Almost there. Okay, so I have all those selections done. And what I need is, remember, just like before, I needed a black and white, right? So now that I have those selections done, I created a new layer just by clicking on the new layer button, and I'm going to paint with black. For my basic piece. Okay? Now, in between these, right, I want it to be kind of fading gray up to white, right? But it's too much work for me to do each as a gradient. So I'm just going to select the inverse, and I'm going to paint the inverse in white. So we'll go ahead and paint this part in white. Okay, that works pretty well. And now that that's done, I'm going to use a different technique to create that little bit of blur to it. Okay? And so I'll deselect. There it is. And I'm going to go up to Filter, and I'm going to go to Blur, and I'm going to go to a Gaussian blur. And that's definitely too much. Right? And I'm going to adjust this value up to where I have, you can kind of see it live, I have a nice dark piece going up to a nice white piece. Does that kind of make sense? Right? Much easier than doing separate little gradients, though I probably would be a little bit more accurate if I did it that way. So I'll go ahead and say OK, and I get this nice blur. I'm going to go back to File, Save for Web, and we're going to call this Displacement. Click Save. Let me turn that one off. I'm going to do a black and white of this for the bump texture. So I'll go to my layer, new adjustment layer, and I'll go to my channel mixer. Okay, we're going to make this monochrome, and I don't think any of these is going to make much difference. Now that one gives a little pixelization, so let's go with that one. And let me go to my once again layer, new adjustment layer, levels. Okay, and I'm going to punch it up so I have a little bit more black, and maybe a little bit more white, something like that. Okay, you can see how this corner is a little bit lighter than the other corner. It'll still work out, but it's a little bit more obvious here. So I'll go ahead and go to File, Save for Web and Devices, or excuse me, Save for Web. I'll click Save, and this is going to be the bump. And I'll go ahead and click Save. Perfect. Okay, so now I have the pieces that I need. If I go back to Rhino, oh, there we go. That's finished rendering. So you can see with that little 1/4 inch, right, I'm getting a very hairy texture, so to speak. Too much, probably, for the sake of the asphalt. But you get an understanding now of what that displacement does and what a big difference it can make. Okay? So in this particular instance, I probably wouldn't keep it that high. And actually, with an asphalt, depending on how close you were doing a rendering, I might turn the displacement off altogether because it might be too much, and just leave the bump on. Okay? So let me go ahead and create this new corrugated metal. So I'm going to go to Create Material. We're going to pick Standard. Let me rename it. This is going to be, I don't even remember what I called it. What did I call it? Corrugated? Corrugated steel. And I'll go ahead and click OK. Now I'm going to, on this new material, first I'm going to pick a map for the diffuse. So let me go ahead and go to Text Bitmap. There we go. I'm going to pick diffuse. I'll say OK. And that will give me the basic look of my steel. I'll say OK. There is no transparency because obviously it's steel. It's going to be solid. I'm going to come down here and under displacement, I'm going to choose a map, bitmap. We're going to pick displacement. And I want to think about how much it's sticking up. Right? An inch for corrugations might be reasonable. We'll see what it looks like. Right? I'm going to turn on my bump. I'll click my material, add a text bitmap, and we're going to use the bump. I'll go ahead and say OK. OK. And this will bump up that texture a little bit too. Okay, and so let me go ahead and apply this to my objects. Apply material to selection. Okay, we can kind of get a sense for what it looks like, and this is where that rendered view looks reasonable. Okay, so it's not too bad. I'm going to go ahead and render this while it's working. And we're going to let it render. It's probably going to take a little while, so you guys can all start at least finding your pieces. But I wanted to spend the time to go through in Photoshop how you would create it. I'm not asking you to do this. I just want you to know how to do it. Okay? So we'll let this continue rendering in the background. When you're looking for materials, and I promised I'd show you some of the other websites, you can Google V-Ray materials, and there are a variety of sites that will let you have them. Some are for different companies or for different programs. Sometimes you have to sign up for a particular site to see it. Sometimes you don't. This one is V-Ray for Cinema 4D, but it has a lot of good files in it. If we look at something, okay, here's travertine. This looks pretty good. I'll click on it. I wonder if this one you have to have an account. I never remember. All right, there it is. It looks pretty reasonable. Yes, I have to log in. I don't remember what my account is, so I'm not going to log in right now. You don't require to. There are sites that don't require it, but the texture actually looks pretty good, and it might be worth adapting. You're going to be able to work with the files, right? So even though it won't work directly, here's another set of different examples. Rhino Shack, another set of examples. So you can really play around. I've had very good results with the V-Ray materials.co.uk. Actually had some emails back and forth with the people who own the site. And so it's a pretty good site, place to get it. The one thing that I ask is that when you make your post, if you use somebody else's material and are making a Rhino version of it, put a link to the original material, because it's obviously not yours. If you create your own, more power to you. You don't have to put links. Okay? So I'll turn you loose and let you go from there. If you have questions or you want me to walk through anything specific, please let me know. The idea today is to get very comfortable with the transparency map, the bump map, the displacement map, what they do, what the settings are, and that sort of thing. Okay? If you can, try to work with a little bit of reflection so you can see kind of how that works as well. but you should have a pretty good understanding of materials at that point. The reason that it's important, even if you're not building your own materials, to understanding how the materials work is because you want to be able to go in and adjust. Sometimes you'll download a material and it'll look really funny, right? It'll look very hairy when you try to render it. And that's because your displacement's too big. And so if you know where to fix it, right? If you use somebody else's material and it's not working, you know how to correct the problem. Okay? So I'll turn you loose from here. Let's see if my Rhino is done. Okay, so in this instance, my displacement is great. My bump is way too strong. So let me go ahead and close that and stop it. Come back to my materials. Let's put that bump back down at 1. And let's try that render again. All right. And I'll let this run a little bit longer, and so you can see it. But again, this is part of the strategy here. Is you have to do these tests. You have to see, is the displacement looking correct, which it actually looks pretty good here. The bump is obviously way off, so you have to work through those various pieces. Okay, so I'm going to let this render, and you guys can start on your way.